I now call the spokesman for the SNP, Drew Hendry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And traditional at this point, I would thank the Chancellor for advance sight of his redacted statement. But having seen the statement, I realise I was given an entirely different redacted document. But not to worry, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've seen all the details in the press over the past day or so. Seeing those unredacted words is nice, but not essential for this response. I can also thank the Chancellor for the courtesy of staying, unlike some of his colleagues, in the chamber to listen to the words of the third party here. It doesn't happen all the time, but I think it's very, very good practice for a party that might well be in the position of third party after the next election. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor during his autumn statement said that was a statement for growth. But what have we seen since his autumn statement? Growth has gone down. It's grown into recession, in fact. And the OBR are saying today, having steadily declined since early 2022, real GDP per person is forecast to trough at 1.25% below its pre-pandemic peak in the first half of 2024. So that was not a statement for growth, and this is not a budget for growth. Again, I do, with the Chancellor, like to start with some measures that I would welcome from his points that he's made today. First of all, albeit the softest possible landing he could have given them, the decision to at least address the non-dom status is a positive move forward. The changes to child benefit, and here we must give credit to Paul Lewis, who's campaigned on this, and indeed, similar to the press, Paul Lewis has tweeted today that he was tipped off by the Chancellor that this was coming, so that's very good as well. The lifetime ISAs move is welcome. The R&D support for aerospace, although the smallest possible step that could have been taken in investment in this industry, again, is something to be welcomed, as is for any further investment in life sciences with this. The Chancellor has put a lot of store on productivity in his speech today. He's going to solve everything with productivity. Yet if we look back over the past 14 years, and indeed before that, one of the things that the UK has been exceptionally poor at is productivity. It hasn't budged at all. So I don't see how the Chancellor, productivity, look at the figures for Scotland. He's saying, what about Scotland? Look at the figures for Scotland over the past 14 years and we can have that debate. He said earlier that vacancies would be easy to fill with immigration. This is the party who imposed Brexit, joined by the Labour Party and now the Lib Dems, and stopped free movement. Of course it would be easy to fill vacancies with people, skilled people who want to do the jobs that we have, who want to fill those vital jobs in tourism, hospitality, the National Health Service, the Care Service, and across many other sectors. But of course that's been taken away by this place. Now, his national insurance cuts today are already being measured by the economists who are looking at this, to point out that the gains will be cancelled, as was last time, by the freeze on thresholds. There's very, very little for people on low incomes, zero for 17.8 million people on less than £12,750. So there is not a lot of sense in the measure that he's taken. He also boasted about the fact of taking over with inflation at 11%. But I think it's important for us to remember the Tory government was in charge when inflation was at 11%. It is their child, this problem with inflation. And they also suggest that somehow 4% is a triumph. 4% is still 4% inflation. Prices still go up. This is, let's face it, this is a last-ditch, tone-deaf approach to desperately try to recover in the polls. It's the embodiment of the Tory party before the people. Where are the real measures that have real impact on the cost of living? The one thing that people need the most direct help with. For those living in fear of the energy bill, being told once again that their direct debits are increasing, slicing more off their take-home pay, none of this is more than cold comfort. To those people staring in disbelief as they realise that their shopping bills are more than 25% higher than they were a couple of years ago, this will stick in their throats. To those trust to their new much higher mortgages and rents directly because of reckless decisions of this place, the walls are closing in for them. And on public services, he's failed people again. Paul Johnson of the IFS noted that the Chancellor would have to explain how public services already on their knees could possibly take more cuts. So let's not forget the £19 billion he slashed from public spending in the autumn statement. They also noted the economic case for tax cuts is weak. The public finances remain in a poor position. And the Chancellor is, in his budget today, promoting a further £20 billion cut, according to the IFS. Public services have already been left struggling after 14 years of underfunding, 14 years of economic chaos and blunder from mini-budgets to Brexit, colossal wastes of hundreds of billions of pounds and fraud and cronyism. Public finances are now so pared to the bone that we can see the marrow. Is it any wonder that a growing number of English councils, one by one, with a Tory, Labour or Lib Dem run, are now effectively bankrupt? People in Scotland needed a budget that delivered funding that would have allowed investment for our public services, real investment in the NHS that supports families, a budget that supports families with the cost of living taken into account and properly invests in green energy. Not another austerity Chancellor taking an even bigger axe to investment than his predecessors. When it does come to that election in Scotland, they will have their say and they will have their choice. It's a clear choice between SNP calls to invest in public services and the economy and in our communities, in our town centres and city centres, in our manufacturing future, in our rural areas, in our tourism industry, in our food and drink sector, in the priorities they hold, in the values that they hold dear. These will be the major dividing lines at the general election. The Scottish Government is committed to protecting people from some of the worst Westminster policies and is making a real difference to the lives of people in Scotland despite their limited powers. The Prime Minister might be under the impression that the cost of living crisis is easing, but that assessment will be a slap in the face for households across Scotland who are still facing the consequences of over a decade of Tory cuts and mismanagement of the economy. People will see straight through attempts by the Chancellor to make up for falling living standards and underfunded public services and wage stagnation with this poorly timed national insurance cut that for most households won't improve their overall standard of life. And leaving aside his failure to deal with the fiscal drag, which, as I said, wipes out much of the benefit of the NI cuts, leaving aside the vast inequality in both benefits to the better off by his actions and the geographical effect that means London benefits much more than anywhere else, he can't escape the fact that the government has now imposed the highest tax burden since the end of World War II. Now, I want to tackle the issues of tax in Scotland. It comes there. In Scotland, our progressive moves that mean that not only do the majority of people pay less tax, but they also pay far lower council tax than in England. They're supported with free prescriptions, don't have to pay tuition fees and get the game-changing Scottish Child Payment and more. Doing what is right, investing in our people, not leaving them high and dry. Whilst the Tories cut public funding in England, the Scottish Government's progressive approach to income tax has worked to raise a significant revenue to invest in public services in Scotland. The Scottish Government's tax regime means that on average households in the lower half of the income distribution are £400 better off a year than they would be in the rest of the UK. Around 58% of households are better off under the Scottish tax and social security system than they would be in the rest of the UK. Taking a different progressive course on income tax in Scotland means that in 24-25, the Scottish Fiscal Commission estimates that the Scottish Government will have around £1.5 billion of additional revenues compared to if it had followed the UK Government's tax policies. The Scottish Government continues to reaffirm their social contract with the Scottish people, with people across Scotland reaping the benefits through, as I've said, free prescription, free university tuition, free school meals, free bus travel for the under-22s, free dental care until 26, publicly owned rail services and free childcare for 2-, 3- and 4-year-olds, and 7 additional welfare payments, including, as I've noted, the revolutionary Scottish Child Payment. Now, before I move on to other matters, let's just talk about the economy and the other measure that that the Chancellor mentioned today, which was freezing the tax on Scotch whisky. As in the autumn statement, you'd say that is not enough. This is a massive industry to Scotland. It's a massive export for both Scotland in terms of food and drink and indeed the UK, and yet it's still taxed at 70-odd%. They needed a cut in that tax today in order to deliver what they could do. And the fact that it wasn't addressed in the budget is a shame on them. Austerity is an ever-decreasing circle, and it's fiscal madness to pursue the same policies that have been failing so obvious for many years. Yet none of these parties can bear to face the truth that for an economy to grow, it needs proper investment, for public services to deliver, to free up the potential of our people. They need to be supported, not asset stripped and starved of those resources. The Chancellor mentioned £2.5 billion for digitisation of the NHS in order to get those so-called productivity gains. How much of that is going to go to private companies, I wonder, when the dust settles? They should have boosted NHS spending by £15 billion to improve healthcare after the UK Government imposed real terms cuts this year. Funding NHS pay properly to match Scotland, where there have been no NHS strikes and caught up for their previous cuts. Where was the announcement on settling with the victims of the contaminated blood scandal? Missing. Silence. Moving on to the economy, he should have turbocharged investment in green energy by investing at least £28 billion a year to compete in the global green energy gold rush and secure sustained economic growth. Where else is the serious high-return growth supposed to come from? We haven't heard it mentioned here today. We don't know where it is. That £28 billion is needed. The Labour advisers have told the Labour Party that £28 billion a year is needed. Everybody knows that £28 billion a year is needed, and yet none of them are willing to make the investment that's needed to protect us. The abandonment of the just transition, and it's fantastic. Oh, they're chuntering from a sedentary position on the Labour front bench. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh dear, imagine picking up on that one. Their big U-turn, their big abandonment of the just transition. Well, it's a pretty big U-turn. I know it's one of many, but it's a pretty big U-turn. The fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, the fact that they're rattled, I think just shows how much they feel this. Their and the Government's abandonment of the just transition and its fantastic opportunity from the Tories and from their shadows in the Labour Party is reckless and stupid, economically and for the desperate need to act on climate change. The failure to invest in this will hold back Scotland from reaching our green energy ambitions and leave households vulnerable to future energy crises. The Chancellor must finally match the level of ambition we're seeing in other countries. They've been shown by the European Union, by the United States with their Inflation Reduction Act that this is an issue that needs to be taken seriously, and yet they are sitting on their hands. Scotland can be at the forefront of the green energy revolution thanks to our incredible natural resources inshore and offshore wind, wave, tidal and hydro power. But with Labour and the Tories intent on pulling the rug from under the industry's feet, we risk seeing yet another generation of energy potential wasted by Westminster. So the Chancellor should finally commit to properly investing in renewables and must decouple the price of gas from the price of electricity. You cannot ensure a just transition from oil and gas for the people and communities that rely on it if you squeeze the life out of the sector overnight. We know that households across Scotland have been badly hit by the energy crisis, and proper investment in renewables can reduce the bills for households. Citizens Advice Scotland revealed that in the last 4 years, they've seen the number of people requesting advice and support with energy bills increase by 14 times. The Labour Party are saying, again from a sedentary position, that I'm going on too long. I take that as a sign they're not comfortable with what I'm saying here, and they would like me to. They're bored. They're bored by the just transition. They're bored by the cost of energy that people have to bear. They're bored by all these things.
About to ask for order so that the honourable gentleman could be heard, but I think that the noise is coming from immediately behind him. But as I have, the honourable gentleman mustn't shout at me. You can shout at other people, but don't shout at me. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can make more progress if uninterrupted, so I do appreciate your advice on that. Talking of advice, I want to come back to Citizens Advice Scotland. They revealed that in the last 4 years they've seen the number of people requesting advice and support with energy bills increase by 14 times. That's a shocking increase. And proper investment in green energy can make sure that people in Scotland never have to face an energy crisis of this scale again. Now, you could have, as I said, helped families with the cost of living by scrapping grossly unfair and unequal energy bill standing charges and using a £12 billion wealth tax to fund a £400 annual energy discount for households, reintroduced mortgage interest tax relief, capped supermarket food prices and matched the Scottish Child Payment UK-wide. It could have boosted UK finances, but he chose not to. By he could have introduced a long overdue essentials guarantee while scrapping callous policies such as the two-child limit and the benefit cap. And of course, one of the most game-changing things he could have done is finally give up on the failed experiment that has been Brexit, rejoin the EU single market and deliver economic growth. Now, the Chancellor must support businesses and introduce measures to support tourism and the hospitality industries. We know that businesses have faced a very challenging period with COVID, Brexit and increased costs from all sides, making life more difficult for people across Scotland. That's why the SNP are calling on the Chancellor to reduce the rate of VAT for the tourism and hospitality sector. It's not too late for him to do that. To reinstate VAT-free shopping for international visitors, and to implement VAT-free streets to support struggling town centres and high streets. If nothing is done to halt the decline, they continue to be ignored, as they have been for too long, then communities will suffer and far more tax will be lost in the longer term than providing them with some support. They could choose to construct these mini enterprise zones, working with devolved governments and local authorities to agree sectors and areas where support is most needed. They could benefit from the reductions in VAT, or if the need is great enough, then no VAT. This could be tied to, for example, businesses agreeing to pay the real living wage. As the Chief Executive of Marks and Spencer said yesterday, he's described operating under the current government as like, and I quote, running up a downwards escalator with a rucksack on your back. If the government can roll out free ports, then why not free ports for people? They could reduce, as I've said, alcohol duty for whisky and other spirits and support Scotland's thriving whisky sector that adds £7.1 billion to the UK economy. Businesses in Scotland can no longer afford to be held back by the UK's low-growth economy. So the Chancellor should bring in measures to support businesses that have been left paying the price for the UK government's disastrous Brexit. It's clear that the SNP is the only party committed to rejoining the EU and giving Scottish businesses the chance to access goods and talent from our 27 closest neighbours. The Scottish Government is committed to protecting people of Scotland from some of the worst Westminster policies and is making a real difference to the lives of people in Scotland despite their limited powers. The cut to the Scottish Government's capital budget and finance transactions has meant that they've had to take some very difficult decisions in this year's budget, but they're still committed to delivering for the people of Scotland. The SNP fully support the £3.3 billion package the UK Government have delivered for Northern Ireland and urge the Chancellor to make similar funding available in line with the Barnett formula to help the Scottish Government deal with the budget pressures they are facing. So the Scottish Government are freezing the council tax, or at least freezing the council tax except in Tory, Lib Dem and some Labour councils where they think that people should pay more. They're lifting 100,000 children out of poverty with measures like the Scottish Child Payment, providing support to help mitigate additional heating costs that households of the most severely disabled children and young people face in the winter months through the child winter housing payments, provide free school meals to all children in primaries 1 to 5 and eligible children throughout the school, providing all babies in Scotland with the essentials needed for the first 6 months of a child's life through the baby box, and introducing 1,140 hours of funded early learning and childcare to all 3- and 4-year-olds and eligible 2-year-olds. Making bus travel free for 2 million people in Scotland, including all children and young people under 22, eligible disabled people and everybody 60 or over. This is just a snapshot of some of the landmark policies the Scottish Government has brought in. And all of these have been achieved against the backdrop of limited powers and being tied to a Westminster system that, as we've seen from this budget today, continues to do nothing for the people of Scotland.
Stewart Hosie.
During his statement today, the Chancellor said, not just higher GDP, but higher GDP per head. Just one slight snag with that. The figures published today for GDP growth per capita, 24 through to 2027, are lower in every single year than the figures they published only a year ago. So it's not higher GDP per head, it's actually lower GDP per head. And I use that as a little example, because we hear the rhetoric and the hyperbole that introduces a budget statement, but it rarely stands any scrutiny when one actually reads the budget documentation. Now, I'm absolutely certain that the government can claim they're going to meet both their fiscal targets at the end of a 5-year future rolling forecast. I think every government could say they're going to meet their targets at the end of a 5-year future rolling forecast. It's what happens in between that's important. Now, they told us a year ago net debt would fall as a share of GDP in 24-25, and that net borrowing would fall below 3% of GDP in 25-26. However, by the time of the autumn statement, only 5 months ago, we were told debt would now not fall until 25-26, a year later, and they still forecast that deficit would fall below 3% of GDP in the same year. We were also told in the spring that GDP growth would exceed 2% in 2 of the next 5 years, and that productivity would sit between 1 and 1.3% every year across 24 to 27. But by the time we reached November, growth was not forecast to exceed 2% in any of the forecast years, and productivity growth was forecast down in every single year. Today, though, the Chancellor announced while they would still meet their primary debt target in the same year, 25-26, the percentage of debt to GDP would be higher than it was only 5 months ago. So, debt not really falling, at best debt stagnating. And GDP growth would still not exceed 2% in any year to 2028. This is really important. Another half-decade where GDP growth will not even meet or reach historic trend growth rates. That is absolutely shameful. And in terms of productivity, the productivity per hour metric which the government like, it is actually lower cumulatively over the new forecast period today than the government announced last November. He said it was a budget for growth, a budget for productivity, a budget for long-term investment. The debt is not really falling as a share of GDP. The deficit is not getting better. It's actually getting worse compared to the forecast last year. And in terms of productivity, that perennial problem which we all recognise exists, productivity growth cumulatively over the entire forecast period is lower than the government announced last November. Of course I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to you giving way. Does he agree that we've got to increase growth, which we all agree on? We've got to get all parts of the United Kingdom growing. And if he looks at the figures from the House of Commons Library, from 2011 to 2021, England grew cumulatively 14.9%, Wales 13.7%, Scotland 7.2%. Does he agree that the Scottish Government need to do more to stimulate growth in Scotland?
I agree that we need growth across the piece. If one of the tools to facilitate growth is tax credits, then I'm sure the Minister recognises tax credits are a function of corporation tax. And therefore, if he's genuinely serious about encouraging growth in Scotland, it devolve powers over business taxation with their associated tax credits. And we'll see how we get on. The point I wanted to make, and I'm coming to a conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that whatever else was said at the start of this statement about growth, about productivity, all the hyperbole, all the big introduction, all the fanfare, this budget actually delivers none of these things, as evidenced by the numbers the government have published themselves today.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I have to say I think today is very much a missed opportunity. Much has been said by colleagues, particularly on the government benches, about the level of debt and about the level of tax. But isn't the fundamental issue, really going right back to the financial crisis in 2008-2009, has been the failure to deliver sustainable economic growth? And we heard much from the Chancellor today about growth and about productivity. But when you dive into the detail, it simply doesn't add up. But of course, the starting point, and it was referred to by my honourable friend earlier on, is about GDP per capita. And the starting point, in many respects, for the debate we should be having today is what's been happening over the course of the last couple of years. Because if you take the period since March 2022, GDP per capita has fallen by as much as 1.5%. Indeed, the OBR tell us that household incomes now are not going to get back to the pre-pandemic level till 2025. The harsh reality for all of our constituents is that they're actually poorer. And when you have all the blah about cutting tax that we've heard today, and I know we've had some criticism of the OBR, but you need to have a set of forecasts to base the decisions that you're taking. But when you look at the OBR forecast for the next 5-year period, then the average GDP growth per annum is 1 2/3%. Actually, the same level as the forecast last November. So for all the changes that have taken place today, there is absolutely zero movement on the needle in terms of expectation of economic growth. And I hope that we do have more of a detailed discussion on these things. And one of the things that was touched on earlier has been the issue of growth, and I would say the issue of productive potential in the UK, because let's have that debate about where that productive potential is and how you grow the economy, because quite simply, I don't see that in what the government has come forward with today. But, you know, when you base the things on the OBR book, as has been talked about, but you look at the detail of some of this, and you talk about the headroom that the government seems to have, which, let's be honest, is limited. But that headroom is based on an assumption that the fuel price escalator takes place every year from now. Well, it hasn't taken place since 2011. So in that sense, what the government's told us today, in terms of the headroom it has, is an absolute fantasy. But then, of course, when you start to look at where we are on tax as a percentage of GDP, it's going to hit 37.1% at the end of the forecast period. We hear many Tory MPs saying that tax is coming down. No, it's not. All that's happening is that some of the tax increases are being ameliorated, and the fiscal drag has been much talked about. But the forecasts that are there is that that fiscal drag from the failure to increase tax bands mean that there's a 40 billion tax take as a consequence of that. So let's have some honesty in terms of what is going on. But where is that plan for growth? Where is that plan for an industrial strategy? And I'm glad that my colleagues in the Scottish Government are taking this seriously. We will have an industrial council. And much has been said about Labour's plans now backtracked on for the 28 billion green investment. But we need to recognise the scale of the opportunity that there is to decarbonise the economy and drive in jobs. And let me just take the example of green energy in Scotland. We can increase our green energy output fivefold. We can create up to 235,000 jobs. If we don't do that, other countries will make that investment, will benefit from the opportunities that there are there in green energy. We need to grasp that. We need to make sure that we can transition that economy. We need to make sure that we're creating the circumstances that people want to come and invest here. But let me then turn, if I may, to public spending. Because again, in real terms, what we see is that over the course of the next few years, that public spending per capita is actually going to be flat. And that, of course, comes after many years of constraint on our public services. But when we take into account the investment which is going into the ring-fenced areas, notably into the NHS, that means between now and 2028 that the actual real terms decline in public spending is 2.3%. Well, what is 2.3%? It's about £20 billion. We often hear people saying that austerity hasn't happened. Well, my goodness. When you look at our constituents and you look at the cuts that are taking place, and look at local authorities in England and look at the challenges that they face, £20 billion to come out over the course of the next few years. It is absolutely shocking what is taking place. And I hear somebody chuntering from a sedentary position about Scotland. Well, my goodness, at least in Scotland, we've tried to ameliorate some of the effects of that. We've invested in the child payment to drive people out of poverty. Because the harsh reality out of this budget is there is no hope for people in Scotland. It's more of the same. It's low growth. It's no increase in productivity. It's no vision. It's no investment in the green economy. And I say to voters in Scotland that come that election, and yes, bring it on, that you're going to have a choice. And you've got a government in Scotland that's got that focus on investing in that industrial strategy, of delivering the new green jobs for the next generation. And you've got more of the same from broken Britain and more pressure on the public services. That is the choice that people in Scotland will face on the back of this budget.